I think it's really important to talk about food because we are currently in the macronutrient wars, and I call here for peace to break out in the macronutrient wars. We have people saying that fat is bad for you. We have people saying that saturated fat is bad for you. We have people saying that carbohydrates should be eradicated from our diet. Carbohydrates are the work of evil things. We have people saying that proteins are... So we have people, and sadly, I'm afraid, we actually have doctors and people who should know better writing books and making a fortune out of saying that we should eat fat, get thin, or we should have zero carbohydrates. And in fact, even in some books, they're redefining the Mediterranean diet, as I said yesterday, as a low carbohydrate, high saturated fat diet. But of course, there's more to food. None of us eat saturated fat. None of us eat carbohydrates. We eat food. So, for example, a carbohydrate. Let's think of a carbohydrate. We can think about the difference between white bread and the kind of bread which has got old grains, ancient grains that are nutritionally better for us. It's about the quality of the carbohydrates. We can think about fructose corn syrup, which is a carbohydrate in Coca-Cola soft drinks. We can compare that with the simple sugars in honey. Honey is nutritionally far better for us than the simple sugars in Coca-Cola. We can talk about saturated fat. Let's talk about cheese. Cheese contains saturated fat. So we think, okay, so I shouldn't eat cheese? Actually, cheese is far more complicated than just being saturated fat. It's not just a lump of saturated fat. So for a start, the cheese of sheep and goats contains different fatty acids, which probably have a different effect on our cholesterol level. It also, particularly if it's unpasteurized or it's aged, it has an effect on our gut microbiome, on our gut bacteria, which is different. So fermented products actually have a decreased risk of developing diabetes, and that's been demonstrated. So some saturated fats, some fermented products. So saturated fats are different. They are more subtle. It's more nuanced. It's a more difficult argument. So let's talk about food. We can talk about cheese. Cheese in moderation can very much be part of a healthy diet. Protein. It's about your choice of protein. So protein is neither bad nor good. You can have protein in red meat, and actually if we consume too much red meat, it's probably associated with an increased risk of cancers, some certain cancers, but we can choose our protein. So we could choose the protein in fish, which of course doesn't just contain protein, it actually contains omega-3 fats, which again we know are good for us. So let's please talk about food. Let's not talk about macronutrients. Fake news. There's a lot of fake news about. We hear about fake news all the time. That there are people claiming that if you follow my diet, you will be cured of all sorts of illnesses tomorrow, and we need to eradicate that. There are dangers of fads and money. We know that. We see diets coming. We see diets going. People are making money from them. People are writing and blogging and selling all sorts of products based on them. We also need to talk about foods combined. So it's not just about macronutrients. It's not even about single foods. It's about, as we've heard with extra virgin olive oil, how you combine your foods together. They have a different impact when we take foods in combination with each other. We don't generally eat foods in isolation. Alcohol is an example of that, for example, because alcohol does have an increased risk of some cancers, particularly of the upper gastrointestinal tract. But drinking alcohol with food as part of a meal in moderation in a Mediterranean-style diet, as Professor Trikopoulou said yesterday, is perfectly compatible with good health. We have a complex internal environment. I always ask my audience who they think eats their food. Who eats your food? So, of course, we don't eat our food. It's our gut bacteria that eat our food, and we eat whatever our gut bacteria fancy leaving to us at the end. So we have a complex internal environment. There's also a sense that actually many scientists agree about what is healthy and what is... 5 more minutes? Is that okay? There are scientists who agree about what we should be eating, which is fundamentally a plant-based diet, Mediterranean-style diet. So actually, although there's a lot of noise, there are groups of people who are getting together, like, for example, an organization in the States called the True Health Initiative, which describes the fundamental principles of a diet which can be healthy. We need to talk about real food. Hashtag real food. We'll get trendy and we'll do a bit of Twitter today. So we need to talk about real food. But actually there's a serious element to it because if we eat real food, it's probably not going to do us too much harm. There's an author in the States called Michael Pollan who wrote a very good book called 10 Food Rules. And one of his rules was, don't eat anything that has in it something your grandmother would not have recognized. And when you imagine the processed foods and you have a look at what's in them, there are all sorts of things that your grandmother would not have recognized. So don't eat them. Eat real food. We need to increase food literacy. That's one of my passions. We need to increase people's understanding of how to prepare and how to consume food healthily. Which brings me finally onto the values bit. So we've done inspiring, we've done the Renaissance, why we need a Renaissance, why we need to educate people again into the wisdoms of the past. We're talking about food now, we're talking about food and getting clear about that, and I want to talk about values, because food values is really important. Malnutrition is an unaffordable global problem. There is a real urgency that we achieve change. And malnutrition can mean different things. Malnutrition can mean something in an impoverished part of the world where people are struggling to eat, and malnutrition can be a problem equally in affluent societies where people are getting the wrong types of nutrition, which is causing them to get chronic diseases. And it is simply unaffordable. We need to think about the value we place on our food in terms of sustainability, and we know that the way in which we're eating at the moment and the way in which the world will increasingly eat over the next few decades is not consistent with our planet surviving climate change. We need to talk about the cost of convenience. So we have convenience food, but what is it costing us? What is it costing us socially? What is it costing us individually in terms of our health? There is a cost of our convenience society. And actually, when we talk about the cost of the Mediterranean diet, there's some quite interesting science, which the Molisani study produced some evidence which seemed to show that the only people who benefited from the Mediterranean diet were people who were on a larger than, I think it was 30,000 euro income a year. But on the other hand, there was a beautiful study from Rhode Island which showed that if you taught people to cook and gave them fresh ingredients, the Mediterranean-style diet, even with extra virgin olive oil, could be cheaper than the convenience diets we have at the moment. The value we place on food, I would say we get what we deserve. And most of us who shop in supermarkets and buy highly processed foods deserve the unhealthy products we get because we often don't value food enough. We have producers who are not being supported because there are discounts on often very unhealthy products as opposed to the fresh products, as opposed to the fresh vegetables and so on. We need to encourage people to make individual investments in food, to value food differently. We need to encourage people to invest the time and the money and to put priority into preparing food, because most of us in the Western world can afford to have most things that we need. So let's prioritize food. And we need to invest as society in education, taxation, and other policies. So that's why I think we need to value food. And so just the final two slides. I just want to ask why we're here. This is a question I asked in the Vatican. Why are we here? That was a good question to ask in the Vatican. I love this quote. I think public intellectuals, which there are many in this room, scientists and so on, have a responsibility to be self-critical on the one hand, to do serious, nuanced work, rigorously executed, but to also be able to get off those perches and out of those ivory towers and speak to the real people who make decisions, to speak truth to power and the powerless, with lucidity and eloquence. So in other words, we need to communicate. We have scientific conferences where we talk about the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. We need to get out there and we need to make sure that people understand it and that we influence people to make changes. So today, I would like to suggest that we need to do more than just sit here and think, yes, everybody should be consuming the Mediterranean diet and here are the interesting scientific reasons why. In the Vatican conference, we produced a statement which is on the website, on the Pontifical Academy's website. The statement is there as a report of the proceedings where we called upon the need for us to invest in education, for us to invest for policymakers to make taxation policies changes, and for the food industry to take great responsibility around the food that they're producing. And as was said at the beginning of this conference, I think what we should do, I think it would be good to produce a letter, a respectful, polite letter to the G7 leaders who are meeting in Milan in about 4 weeks' time to request that they look to investing far more in education about food values, educating the new generation in the importance of eating well, of regarding food properly and making any taxation policies that possible, which will actually change the way in which people eat so that they are directed towards a more healthy form of eating. So in the next few days, I'm going to compose, with help and support, a letter which we are going to get signed not just by people here, but I hope by influencers across the world to address the G7 leaders, to ask them to make some of these investments, to draw their attention to the importance of food values. So I'm sorry I've been a very long talk, and forgive me. I hope it wasn't too long, but thank you.